The rain was pounding against the windshield as Jessica slammed on the brakes in the middle of downtown Denver. "Get out," she said, her voice ice-cold as she stared straight ahead, refusing to even look at me. "I'm serious, David. Get out of my car right now." I sat there in the passenger seat, completely soaked from our argument that had started at the coffee shop. Watching the water streak down the windows like tears I refused to shed. This was the 4th time in 2 months she'd kicked me out of her BMW, leaving me stranded miles from my apartment. But something about this moment felt different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maybe it was the way she said my full name instead of Dave. Or maybe it was the fact that she'd done it in front of Ryan, again her new marketing assistant who seemed to find my humiliation endlessly entertaining. As I stepped out into the freezing November night, my backpack heavy with architecture, textbooks, and my laptop, I heard Ryan's laughter echo from inside the car before she sped off, leaving me standing under a broken streetlight. That's when I knew our 4-year relationship was truly over, and the acceptance letter from the London firm burning a hole in my pocket suddenly felt like salvation. Rather than a difficult choice, standing on that empty street corner in downtown Denver, watching Jessica's taillights disappear into the night, I realized I'd been making excuses for her behavior for way too long. The cold November air cut through my jacket as I pulled out, my phone to call an Uber, my hands shaking, not from the temperature, but from the rage building inside my chest. $27 for a ride back to my studio apartment near campus money I didn't really have as a graduate student living, off ramen noodles and student loans while she drove around in a car that cost more than my entire education. The thing is, Jessica and I weren't always like this. When we met 4 years ago during our junior year at the University of Colorado, Denver, she was different. I was this quiet architecture student who spent most of his time hunched over drafting tables in the library, and she was this vibrant marketing major who seemed to light up every room she entered. She had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the world when she looked at me, those green eyes sparkling with genuine interest as I rambled about sustainable building design and urban planning theories that probably bored everyone else to tears. Our first date was at this little coffee shop called The Grind near campus. Nothing fancy, just 2 college kids sharing a chocolate chip muffin and talking until they kicked us out at closing time. Jessica listened to my dreams about revolutionizing affordable housing with innovative design, and I was captivated by her passion for digital marketing and her plans to help small businesses grow through social media strategies. She wore this simple blue sweater that brought out her eyes, and when she laughed at my terrible jokes about architectural puns, I knew I was completely done for. Those early days felt like a fairy tale designed specifically for us. We'd spend weekends hiking the trails around Boulder, where Jessica would take photos of mountain landscapes for her photography hobby while I sketched building concepts inspired by the natural rock formations. She'd pack these elaborate picnic lunches, with sandwiches cut into perfect triangles and homemade cookies, insisting that proper nutrition was essential for creative thinking. During those golden autumn afternoons, lying on a blanket with her head on my chest while I read architecture magazines out loud, I genuinely believed we'd figured out something special that other couples hadn't. The shift started so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. After graduation, Jessica landed this incredible position at a tech startup downtown, some revolutionary marketing firm that specialized in helping companies build their brand presence across multiple platforms. The salary was impressive, especially compared to my measly income from my part-time drafting job at a small residential design firm. And suddenly, she was moving into this sleek downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Rocky Mountains that made my cramped studio look like a closet. At first, I was genuinely happy for her success. Jessica had always been ambitious and driven, qualities I found incredibly attractive, and watching her excel in her career made me proud to be her boyfriend. She'd come home with stories about million-dollar accounts and celebrity clients, her eyes bright with excitement as she described the cutting-edge campaigns she was developing. I'd listen intently while helping her cook dinner in her new stainless steel kitchen, asking questions about her projects and celebrating her victories like they were my own. But somewhere along the way, those celebration dinners turned into Jessica talking while I listened, my own achievements and struggles becoming footnotes in conversations dominated by her rising star when I'd try to share news about my thesis, project, or a potential internship opportunity. She'd nod politely before redirecting the conversation back to her latest client acquisition or the new BMW she was considering purchasing with her bonus money. The dynamic was shifting, and I was too invested in making things work to acknowledge what was happening. The car became a symbol of everything that was changing between us. But when she finally purchased that pearl white BMW with the leather interior and premium sound system, it felt like she was buying her way into a different social class, one that didn't necessarily include a struggling graduate student who rode the bus to campus every day. She'd pick me up for dates, and I'd feel underdressed sitting in that pristine interior, hyper-aware of every coffee stain on my jeans and every scuff mark on my sneakers. That's around the time Ryan entered the picture. Jessica's company hired him as her new assistant, this polished guy fresh out of business school with perfectly styled hair and expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She'd mention him constantly during our conversations, telling me about his innovative ideas for client presentations and his natural talent for reading market trends. Ryan understood the business world in ways I never could, she'd explain, and their professional chemistry was making her job so much more enjoyable and productive. I tried to be supportive because that's what good boyfriends do, right? When Jessica started working late nights with Ryan on important campaigns, I'd order pizza to her office and bring coffee for both of them, trying to be the understanding partner who respected her career ambitions. Ryan would thank me with this condescending smile that never quite reached his eyes, making comments about how lucky Jessica was to have such a thoughtful boyfriend who knew his place in her priorities. The first time Jessica kicked me out of her car, it was supposedly an accident, a moment of frustration that she immediately apologized for afterward. We'd been driving back from dinner with her work colleagues, and I'd made some comment about sustainable architecture that apparently embarrassed her in front of her new professional circle. She pulled over 3 blocks from the restaurant and told me to get out, saying she needed space to think and would call me later. I walked 6 miles back to my apartment that night, telling myself that everyone makes mistakes when they're stressed about work, and Jessica was just adjusting to the pressures of her new position. The second time happened after I mentioned my professor's recommendation for a summer internship with a green building initiative in Portland. Jessica's response was to laugh. Not with me, but at me, asking if I seriously thought she'd follow me to some hippie city where I'd be making minimum wage while working for environmental activists. When I tried to explain that the experience would be valuable for my career development, she pulled into a gas station parking lot and pointed toward the door. Maybe you should walk home and think about whether you're ready to be serious about our future together, she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. Ryan, who had somehow ended up in the back seat during what was supposed to be our date night, just shook his head sympathetically, like he felt sorry for Jessica having to deal with such an unrealistic boyfriend. By the third time, I was starting to recognize the pattern, but I was still making excuses for her behavior because I loved the person she used to be and kept hoping that version of Jessica would resurface. We'd been at a house party thrown by one of her coworkers. I'd spent most of the evening listening to conversations about marketing strategies and client management techniques that went completely over my head. When someone asked what I did for work, and I mentioned my part-time position at the design firm while working toward my master's degree, Jessica actually rolled her eyes and made a comment about how some people were still figuring out their lives in their mid-20s. The humiliation burned in my chest as Ryan stepped in to change the subject, his hand landing possessively on Jessica's shoulder as he steered the conversation toward safer topics. Later, during the drive home, when I quietly asked Jessica why she'd felt the need to belittle my career in front of her friends, she exploded. She accused me of being overly sensitive and unable to handle constructive criticism, claiming that my lack of ambition was holding both of us back from achieving our potential as a couple. The car screeched to a halt outside a 24-hour dinner, and she ordered me out, saying I could call myself an Uber when I was ready to apologize for ruining her evening with my insecurity. Each incident followed the same script, Jessica would create a situation where I felt small and inadequate. I'd react with hurt or confusion, and she'd use my emotional response as justification for abandoning me somewhere inconvenient. The worst part wasn't the long walks home or the expensive ride-sharing fees I couldn't afford it. It was the way she'd framed these moments as my fault, like I was the one with unreasonable expectations about how partners should treat each other. But that final night, the fourth time, something had shifted inside me before I even got into her car. Earlier that day, I'd received an email that changed everything. An acceptance letter from Thornfield and Associates, prestigious architectural firm in London that specialized in sustainable urban development projects. They were offering me a position as a junior designer with a salary that would actually allow me to pay my bills while working on the kind of innovative projects I'd only dreamed about during my undergraduate years. The opportunity had come through Professor Martinez, who'd maintained connections with international firms and believed why thesis work on eco-friendly housing solutions would be valuable in the European market. London represented everything I wanted in my career: a chance to work on meaningful projects, financial independence, and the opportunity to prove myself in a competitive field without constantly being reminded of my current limitations. I'd printed out the offer letter and tucked it into my jacket pocket, planning to share the news with Jessica over dinner at our usual spot downtown. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This felt like a moment that deserved celebration, a sign that my hard work and dedication were finally paying off in tangible ways. Maybe this success would remind Jessica of the ambitious person she'd fallen in love with during those early days when we'd talked about building our futures together. The conversation didn't go the way I'd imagined. When I pulled out the letter at the restaurant and explained the opportunity, Jessica's first question wasn't about my excitement or the details of the position. It was about the timing and how this would affect her career trajectory. She pointed out that her current project with Ryan was entering a critical phase that could result in a promotion to senior marketing director, and the idea of maintaining a long-distance relationship while she was focused on advancing her position seemed impractical and unnecessarily complicated. Ryan, who had somehow joined us for what I'd thought would be an intimate dinner conversation, nodded in agreement and added his own observations about the challenges of international relationships and the importance of being realistic about career priorities. He mentioned several examples of couples who'd tried to make similar arrangements work, all of which had ended in disappointment and resentment when practical considerations outweighed romantic idealism. As I listened to them discuss my future, like I wasn't sitting right there at the table, I felt something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. This wasn't a conversation about our relationship or my career. It was Jessica and Ryan making decisions about what would be most convenient for their professional partnership, with my dreams being treated as an inconvenient complication that needed to be managed or eliminated. The argument that followed was inevitable. I asked Jessica if she could at least pretend to be happy about my achievement before explaining why it wouldn't work, and she responded by questioning whether I'd even consulted her before applying for international positions. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd made unilateral decisions about everything from our social calendar to our living arrangements was now upset about my supposed lack of communication. Regarding my own career opportunities, things escalated quickly from there, with Jessica accusing me of being selfish and impractical while I pointed out the hypocrisy of her criticism coming from someone who'd never once asked for my input on her major life decisions. Ryan sat between us, looking uncomfortable but making no effort to excuse himself from what was clearly a private conversation between a couple trying to navigate a relationship crisis. By the time we reached her car, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica drove in angry silence while Ryan made awkward small talk from the back seat, trying to lighten the mood with observations about the weather and upcoming work projects. I stared out the passenger window at the city lights blurring past, wondering when exactly I'd become such a minor character in my own relationship that major decisions about our future were being made without my meaningful participation. That's when Jessica pulled over in the middle of downtown Denver, in front of a closed bookstore, with rain starting to fall from the dark November sky. "Get out," she said, and there was something final in her voice that I'd never heard before. Not anger or frustration, but a cold dismissal that made me feel like I was being fired from a job I'd never really qualified for in the first place. I looked at her profile, illuminated by the streetlights, and saw a stranger wearing my girlfriend's face. This wasn't the woman who'd packed picnic lunches and listened to my architectural theories with genuine interest. This wasn't the person who'd held my hand during scary movies and left encouraging notes in my textbooks during finals week. This was someone who'd grown into a version of herself that had no room for the person I was or the dreams I was pursuing. Ryan's presence in the back seat made everything worse, like Jessica needed a witness to my humiliation or backup support for whatever point she was trying to make about my inadequacy as a partner. The way he avoided eye contact while I gathered my things suggested he understood exactly what was happening and felt awkward about his role in this moment. No, but not awkward enough to suggest that maybe kicking me out of the car in the rain wasn't the most mature way to handle a relationship disagreement. As I stood on that sidewalk watching her BMW disappear into the night, I realized that I'd been clinging to a relationship that had ended months ago, maybe even longer. The Jessica I'd fallen in love with had evolved into someone whose priorities and values were fundamentally incompatible with mine. And no amount of compromise or understanding on my part was going to bridge that gap. The acceptance letter was still in my pocket, slightly crumpled now, but representing a future that suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary. London wasn't just a career opportunity anymore. It was my chance to rediscover who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to fit into someone else's vision of what my life should look like. Standing in my cramped studio apartment later that night, still damp from the rain and emotionally drained from the evening's events, I found myself staring at the acceptance letter spread out on my small kitchen table. The Thornfield and Associates letterhead looked official and important under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Stark contrast to the rejection I'd just experienced on that downtown street corner. My laptop was open beside it, showing the email thread with Professor Martinez, who'd been checking in about my decision timeline. And for the first time in months, I felt a spark of excitement about my future that had nothing to do with Jessica's. Approval or disapproval? The apartment felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The architectural books stacked on every available surface. The sketches pinned to the walls. The models I'd built during late-night design sessions, all of it represented years of passion and dedication that Jessica had gradually trained me to downplay or apologize for. When had I started feeling ashamed of my interests, my goals, my entire field of study? When had I begun measuring my worth through her reactions rather than my own achievements? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text message history, a digital record of how our communication had shifted over the past year. The early conversations were full of inside jokes, shared plans, and genuine affection. Jessica would send me photos of interesting buildings she'd spotted around the city, knowing I'd appreciate the design elements, and I'd respond with long messages analyzing the architectural features that caught her eye. We'd plan weekend trips to visit Frank Lloyd Wright houses or tour sustainable building projects, adventures that fed both our interests and strengthened our connection. But somewhere along the timeline, the messages became transactional. Would text about scheduled changes, work obligations, or social events I was expected to attend. My responses grew shorter, less enthusiastic, or focused on accommodating her needs than expressing my own thoughts or feelings. The spontaneous conversations about our dreams and aspirations were replaced by logistical coordination and damage control after arguments I never seemed to see coming. One particular exchange from 3 weeks earlier stood out painfully. Sent her a photo of an innovative housing project I'd discovered during my research. Excited about the way the architects had integrated solar technology with traditional building materials. Her response had been a simple nice followed immediately by a longer message about Ryan's ideas for the promotional campaign they were developing. The contrast was stark. My passionate interests reduced to polite acknowledgement, while her colleagues' contributions received detailed enthusiasm and analysis. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my design portfolio and really looked at my work. The projects I'd completed during my undergraduate years showed clear evolution and creativity, each one building on lessons learned from the previous assignment. My thesis project, focused on affordable housing solutions for urban environments, represented hundreds of hours of research, planning, and revision. The sustainability calculations alone had taken weeks to perfect, and the community integration aspects had required interviewing dozens of residents in low-income neighborhoods to understand their actual needs and preferences. This was meaningful work, important work, the kind of career I'd dreamed about since my first architecture class. Professor Martinez had called my thesis innovative and said it addressed real-world problems with practical solutions that could actually be implemented. The London firm had specifically mentioned my research in their acceptance letter, explaining that my approach to environmental sustainability aligned perfectly with their current project development in emerging urban markets. Yet somehow, over the course of my relationship with Jessica, I'd internalized the idea that my career was less important, less impressive, less worthy of respect than hers. When had I started believing that marketing campaigns for tech startups were inherently more valuable than designing homes for families who couldn't afford traditional housing options? When had I accepted the narrative that my financial struggles as a graduate student reflected some fundamental flaw in my character rather than a temporary situation that would improve with time and experience? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jessica's treatment of me hadn't developed overnight. It had been a gradual process, so subtle that I hadn't recognized what was happening until I was completely immersed in a dynamic that left me constantly questioning my own worth and priorities. She'd never explicitly said my dreams were worthless, but she'd consistently responded to my achievements with lukewarm enthusiasm while celebrating every minor success in her own career with elaborate fanfare. When I'd won a design competition, during my second year of graduate school, earning both recognition and a small cash prize, Jessica's response had been to immediately shift the conversation to her own work challenges and suggest we use the prize money for a dinner at the expensive restaurant where her colleagues frequently networked. My moment of triumph became an opportunity for her to advance her professional relationships, and I'd been so grateful for her attention that I hadn't questioned the appropriateness of that arrangement. The pattern extended beyond career issues into every aspect of our relationship. Jessica made decisions about our social calendar based on what would benefit her networking efforts, often committing us to events where I knew no one and had nothing meaningful to contribute to the conversations. When I'd suggest activities that interested me, visiting architectural sites, attending lectures by visiting professors, exploring new neighborhoods with interesting building styles, she'd agree reluctantly and spend the entire time checking her phone or making comments about how we could be using our time more productively. Even our physical intimacy had become another area where Jessica's needs and preferences took priority, while mine were treated as inconvenient obstacles to her satisfaction. She'd initiate contact when she was in the mood, but respond with irritation if I approached her when she was focused on work or social media. The spontaneous affection that had characterized our early relationship, hand-holding during movies, surprise kisses while cooking together, lazy Sunday morning conversations in bed, had been replaced by scheduled encounters that felt more like obligations than expressions of genuine desire. The financial imbalance between us had become another source of subtle manipulation that I'd been too proud or too blind to acknowledge. Jessica would suggest expensive restaurants or activities, knowing I couldn't afford them, then offer to pay with an air of generous sacrifice that made me feel simultaneously grateful and diminished. Buy me gifts that were more about her tastes than my interests, expensive items that I appreciated but didn't particularly want, creating a sense of obligation that was difficult to navigate gracefully. When I'd try to suggest more affordable alternatives or plan dates within my budget, Jessica would agree with visible disappointment, making comments about how she missed being able to enjoy nice things without worrying about money. The implication was always that my financial limitations were holding her back from living the lifestyle she deserved, and that a better boyfriend would find ways to provide the experiences she wanted rather than forcing her to lower her standards to accommodate his circumstances. Ryan's presence in our relationship had accelerated these dynamics rather than creating them. He represented everything Jessica valued: financial success, professional advancement, social connections that could benefit her career, and the kind of lifestyle she wanted to maintain. When she talked about him, her voice carried an enthusiasm and respect that had been missing from her conversations about me for months. She'd describe his insights as brilliant, his suggestions as innovative, his company as stimulating in ways that highlighted the contrast with her experience of our relationship. The fact that Ryan was attracted to Jessica was obvious to everyone except apparently Jessica herself, or maybe she simply chose not to acknowledge what was happening because the attention served her purposes. He'd find excuses to text her outside work hours, always with some urgent question or brilliant idea that couldn't wait until the next business day. Their work dinners stretched later and later, their collaboration becoming more intensive and exclusive. Their professional relationship developing personal elements that made me uncomfortable whenever I tried to raise concerns. When I'd mentioned feeling uneasy about the amount of time Jessica was spending with Ryan, she'd accuse me of being possessive and insecure, qualities that were unattractive and unfair to someone who was simply trying to excel in her career. The fact that I didn't understand the demands of her professional environment, she explained, meant I wasn't qualified to offer opinions about her work relationships or the time management decisions required for success in competitive industries. But standing in my apartment that night, finally seeing the situation clearly, I understood that my concerns had been completely valid. Ryan wasn't just Jessica's colleague, or even her work partner. He was her emotional replacement for me, someone who provided the intellectual stimulation and professional validation she felt was missing from our relationship. The three of us had been in a triangle for months, with me playing the role of the officially recognized boyfriend while Ryan functioned as her actual companion in all the ways that mattered to her. The cruelest part was how Jessica had used my love for her as a weapon against my self-respect. Every time I'd raise concerns about our relationship dynamics, she'd remind me of our history together, the time we'd invested, the plans we'd made during happier periods. She'd reference specific memories from our early dating years, moments when I'd been completely devoted to making her happy, and use those examples to suggest that my current dissatisfaction represented some character flaw or temporary confusion, rather than a legitimate response to changed circumstances. I'd allowed myself to believe that love meant accepting whatever treatment my partner offered. That commitment required sacrificing my own needs and preferences to maintain harmony. Jessica had reinforced this belief by framing every conflict as evidence of my inability to handle the challenges of a mature relationship, my tendency to create drama instead of supporting her growth and success. But love shouldn't require one person to consistently diminish themselves to make the other person feel powerful. Healthy relationships involved mutual support, shared decision-making, and respect for both partners' goals and aspirations. What Jessica and I had developed wasn't love, it was a hierarchy where she held all the power and I provided whatever validation or accommodation she needed to feel secure in her superiority. The London opportunity represented more than just a career advancement. It was my chance to rediscover who I was when I wasn't constantly adapting myself to fit someone else's expectations. Living in a new city, working on projects that aligned with my values, building professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than romantic obligation, all of it sounded like freedom. After months of feeling trapped in a dynamic that brought out the worst in both of us, I thought about the practical aspects of making such a dramatic change. My lease would expire at the end of December, giving me just enough time to finalize the London arrangements and tie up loose ends in Denver. The firm had offered relocation, assistance, and help with visa documentation, standard benefits that would make the transition manageable rather than overwhelming. Professor Martinez had already connected me with former students working in London, potential sources of friendship and professional networking that would ease the social challenges of international relocation. More importantly, I thought about the emotional aspects of starting over. How long had it been since I'd felt genuinely excited about my future rather than anxious, about navigating Jessica's moods and expectations? When was the last time I'd made a major decision based on my own interests, rather than their potential impact on our relationship? The idea of waking up each morning focused on my work, my goals, my personal growth, rather than managing conflict or seeking approval, felt almost too good to believe. There would be challenges, certainly. Moving to a foreign country meant adapting, two different cultural norms, building new social connections, and proving myself in an unfamiliar professional environment. But these were the kinds of positive challenges that came with growth and opportunity. Problems I'd solve through effort and creativity, rather than the exhausting emotional labor required to maintain a relationship with someone who fundamentally didn't respect or value my contributions. As the hours passed and dawn began filtering through my small apartment windows, I found myself thinking about the kind of person I wanted to become rather than the kind of boyfriend I'd been trying to be. In London, I could focus on developing my skills, pursuing projects that mattered to me, and forming relationships based on shared interests and mutual appreciation. I could stop apologizing for my ambitions and start celebrating my achievements without worrying about how my success might threaten someone else's sense of superiority. The acceptance letter was still spread out on my kitchen table when I finally made my decision. I opened my laptop and began typing a response to Thornfield and Associates, formally accepting their offer and requesting information about start dates and relocation logistics. The words flowed easily, professionally, with none of the second-guessing and anxiety that had characterized most of my communications during the past year. By the time I finished the email and hit send, the sun was fully up, and I could hear my neighbors beginning their morning routines. I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't even realized was there until it was gone. Relief was immediate and profound, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop fighting against your own instincts and start moving in the direction your life was always meant to go. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as I threw myself into the logistics of international relocation with an energy I hadn't felt in months. Thornfield and Associates responded to my acceptance with comprehensive information packets, visa application forms, and contact details for their human resources department in London. The efficiency of their communications stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had characterized my recent interactions with Jessica. Found myself appreciating the straightforward professionalism of people who valued clear expectations and mutual respect. I hadn't heard from Jessica since that night in the rain, which was unusual, but not entirely surprising given the finality of our last interaction. Normally, after one of our arguments, she'd reach out within 24 hours with some combination of blame-shifting and grudging reconciliation, a pattern that had trained me to wait anxiously for her contact rather than taking initiative myself. This time, the silence felt different, permanent rather than punitive, and I was surprised to discover that I felt relieved rather than desperate to restore communication. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Marcus, my best friend. Since sophomore year, who'd been watching my relationship deteriorate with increasing concern and hadn't been shy about expressing his opinions. Marcus worked as a software developer for a gaming company downtown, and his straightforward personality had never meshed well with Jessica's more complicated emotional dynamics. He'd invited me for drinks several times over the past few months, clearly wanting to discuss what he saw happening, but I'd consistently declined his offers because I knew he'd say things I wasn't ready to hear. Now sitting in his favorite brewery near campus, I found myself grateful for his persistence and his refusal to pretend everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. Marcus listened to my account of the past few days without interruption, occasionally shaking his head or muttering comments under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. When I finished explaining about the London opportunity and my decision to accept it, he was quiet for several minutes, staring into his beer with an expression I couldn't read. "You know what the crazy part is?" Marcus finally said, looking up at me with a mixture of frustration and relief. "I've been waiting for you to have this conversation for almost 2 years. Every time we'd hang out, I'd watch you check your phone constantly, worried about Jessica's mood or whether you'd said something wrong in your last text exchange. You used to be this confident guy with strong opinions about everything from building codes to environmental policy, and somewhere along the way you turned into someone who apologized for having preferences." His words stung because they were accurate. I could remember specific instances when I'd changed my opinions mid-conversation after receiving disapproving looks from Jessica. Competitive instincts. Social situations where I'd remain silent rather than risk saying something that might embarrass her in front of her professional contacts. The transformation had been so gradual that I hadn't recognized how fundamentally I'd altered my personality to accommodate her expectations. Marcus continued, his voice gaining intensity as he warmed to his subject. The night you brought her to my birthday party last year, she spent the entire evening making comments about how young and immature my friends were. Like she was doing you some huge favor by attending a gathering beneath her sophisticated standards. Then she insisted you leave early because she had important work to do the next morning, and you actually apologized to me for cutting out of my own party. That's when I knew she'd completely rewritten your sense of what normal behavior looks like in a relationship. I remembered that night clearly now, though at the time I'd been so focused on managing Jessica's visible discomfort that I hadn't processed how her attitude had affected everyone else at the party. She'd made no effort to engage with Marcus's friends, most of whom were fellow developers and gamers who shared interests that overlapped significantly with my own technical background. Instead of finding common ground, or at least being politely social, she'd positioned herself as an observer, critiquing people who were clearly beneath her level of sophistication and professional success. When one of Marcus's colleagues had asked about my thesis project and seemed genuinely interested in my research on sustainable housing, Jessica had interrupted to explain that I was still figuring out my career direction while she was already established in her field. The implication was that my graduate studies represented some kind of delayed development rather than deliberate preparation for meaningful work. And I'd been so mortified by her characterization that I'd spent the rest of the evening avoiding conversations about my academic progress. The worst part, Marcus said, leaning forward across the small brewery table, was watching you start to believe her version of who you were. You'd introduce yourself as just a graduate student, like that was somehow embarrassing, instead of talking about your research or your design work the way you used to. You let her convince you that your interests were boring or impractical, and everyone who knew you before could see how much smaller you'd become. The conversation was painful, but necessary, like having an infected wound cleaned properly for the first time in months. Marcus had maintained perspective on my relationship that I'd lost completely. His observations helped me understand that the changes I'd noticed in myself weren't the natural evolution of maturity. They were the result of systematic psychological pressure that had gradually eroded my confidence and self-respect. We talked until the brewery closed, covering everything from specific incidents I'd rationalized or forgotten to broader patterns of behavior that had become normalized in my relationship with Jessica. Marcus helped me recognize that healthy partnerships involved both people encouraging each other's growth and celebrating each other's successes, rather than one person consistently diminishing the other to maintain a sense of superiority. Next morning, I woke up with renewed determination to focus on my London preparations rather than dwelling on the relationship I was leaving behind. The visa application process was complex, but manageable, requiring documentation of my educational background, employment history, and financial resources that painted a picture of my life that was considerably more impressive than Jessica's. Recent characterizations had led me to believe reviewing my academic transcripts and letters of recommendation from professors reminded me that I'd actually performed quite well during my graduate studies, maintaining high grades while working part-time and conducting research that had caught the attention of international firms. The gap between my objective achievements and my subjective sense of inadequacy was striking. Evidence of how thoroughly Jessica's perspective had infiltrated my self-perception. Professor Martinez scheduled a meeting to discuss the London transition and provide additional contacts in the European architectural community. Sitting in his office, surrounded by books and project photos from decades of innovative design work, I felt reconnected to the intellectual excitement that had originally drawn me to architecture. We spent 2 hours discussing sustainable building practices, urban planning challenges, and the kinds of projects Thornfield and Associates was developing in emerging markets. You know, David, Professor Martinez said, as our meeting was winding down, I've had several students over the years who were academically capable, but lacked the vision and dedication necessary for truly innovative work. You're not one of those. Students, your thesis research shows both technical competence and creative thinking that could contribute significantly to the field, particularly in areas where environmental concerns intersect with social justice issues. His confidence in my abilities was both gratifying and sobering, a reminder that my professional worth wasn't determined by Jessica's assessment of my career prospects. Professor Martinez had decades of experience evaluating student potential, and his recommendation had been strong enough to secure an international position with a respected firm. Perhaps my judgment about my own capabilities was more reliable than the doubt that had been systematically cultivated over the past year. The administrative aspects of leaving Denver were surprisingly straightforward. My lease agreement included a clause allowing early termination with appropriate notice, and my landlord was understanding about my employment situation. Most of my furniture was secondhand and not worth the expense of international shipping, so I arranged to sell or donate nearly everything except my books, design materials, and personal items that could fit in a few suitcases. The process of sorting through my possessions became an unexpected exercise in rediscovering my own interests and priorities. I found sketchbooks full of building designs I'd forgotten about, ideas that had excited me before I'd started filtering my creativity through Jessica's judgment. There were photos from architecture field trips, conference programs from sustainability, workshops, correspondence with professors whose research aligned with my own interests, all evidence of a rich academic and professional life that existed completely independently of my romantic relationship. I also found gifts from Jessica scattered throughout my apartment, items that had seemed thoughtful at the time, but now appeared to reflect her tastes more than any understanding of my preferences. The expensive watch she'd given me for my birthday. It was beautiful but impractical for someone who spent most of his time bent over drafting tables or visiting construction sites. The clothing she'd selected for me was stylish but formal, appropriate for the kind of professional networking events she attended, but unsuitable for the casual academic environment where I felt most comfortable. More telling were the gifts I'd given her that had been returned to my apartment over time, supposedly for safekeeping, but effectively removing them from her living space. The architectural photography book I'd chosen because it featured buildings from cities we'd talked about, visiting together, the handmade pottery from a local artist whose work celebrated sustainable craft practices. Now, the simple jewelry I'd selected based on her actual preferences rather than what I thought would impress her friends. All of it had gradually migrated back to my space, evidence that she'd never fully integrated our relationship into her personal environment. As December approached and my departure date became more concrete, I realized that I hadn't missed Jessica as much as I'd expected to. The anxiety and emotional volatility that had characterized our relationship had been replaced by a calm focus on practical tasks and future planning. I slept better, ate more regularly, and found myself looking forward to each day's activities, rather than dreading potential conflicts or disappointments. The absence of constant text message negotiations was particularly liberating.
Nice.
Instead of spending mental energy interpreting Jessica's mood through her communication style or crafting responses that wouldn't trigger her irritation, I could focus completely on my work and my preparation for the international move. The silence that had initially felt strange now seemed natural, like returning to a peaceful baseline that I'd forgotten was possible. My parents, who lived about 2 hours outside Denver, were initially concerned about my decision to move so far away with such short notice. They'd met Jessica several times during family gatherings and had maintained polite neutrality about our relationship, though I suspected they'd observed some of the same dynamics that Marcus had noticed. When I explained the career opportunity and my reasons for accepting it, they were supportive but worried about the practical challenges of international relocation. "Are you sure this isn't just a reaction to relationship stress?" my mother asked during a long phone conversation about my London plans. Major life changes during emotional upheaval don't always lead to better outcomes. And you've worked so hard on your education here in Colorado. I understood her concern, but I was confident that my decision was based on genuine career considerations rather than escape impulses. The Thornfield and Associates position aligned perfectly with my research interests and professional goals, offering opportunities for advancement that weren't available in the Denver market. The fact that it also removed me from a relationship dynamic that had become destructive was beneficial, but not the primary motivation for my choice. We discussed the practical aspects of maintaining family relationships across international boundaries, the timeline for potential visits, and my plans for establishing myself professionally in London. My parents had raised me to be independent and goal-oriented, and they ultimately recognized that this opportunity represented exactly the kind of career development they'd hoped my education would provide. The conversation also revealed how much my confidence had been undermined by Jessica's constant criticism of my prospects and abilities. Talking to my parents about my achievements and future plans, I heard myself describe my work with enthusiasm and pride that had been missing from my self-presentation for months. They were impressed by the scope of my research, the international recognition of my thesis project, and the competitive nature of the position I'd secured. "You sound more like yourself than you have in a long time," my father observed toward the end of our conversation. "I was starting to worry that you'd lost some of your natural optimism and determination. But this decision seems to have brought back the David we raised." His comment was perceptive and accurate. I had lost significant aspects of my personality during my relationship with Jessica, not through any conscious decision, but through the gradual erosion that occurs when someone consistently undermines your judgment and achievements. The process of planning my London move had reconnected me with my own goals and preferences, reminding me that I was capable of making good decisions and pursuing meaningful work. As my departure date approached, I found myself looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that awaited me in London, rather than dwelling on what I was leaving behind in Denver. The relationship that had once seemed like the most important aspect of my life now felt like a distraction from the career and personal growth that would define my future happiness and success. 2 weeks before my scheduled departure to London, Jessica finally broke her silence with a phone call that came at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. I was in the middle of packing my design materials when my phone rang, her name appearing on the screen for the first time since that rainy evening downtown. For a moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button as I considered whether I wanted to reopen communication that had felt so definitively closed. "David, we need to talk," she said when I finally answered, her voice carrying none of the warmth or vulnerability I might have expected after weeks of separation. Instead, she sounded businesslike, almost impatient, as if my unavailability had been an inconvenience to her schedule rather than the natural consequence of her own actions. "I heard from Ryan that you're planning some kind of dramatic move to Europe. We should discuss this like adults before you make any irreversible decisions." The fact that she'd learned about my London plans through Ryan, rather than directly from me, spoke volumes about how completely our communication had broken down. But it also revealed that she'd been monitoring my activities through mutual connections, rather than respecting the space that had developed between us. Her characterization of my career move as a dramatic decision rather than a professional opportunity immediately triggered the familiar frustration I'd hoped to leave behind. "There's nothing to discuss, Jessica," I replied, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "I accepted a position with an architectural firm in London. It's exactly the kind of work I've been preparing for, and I start in January. This isn't a reaction to our relationship ending. It's a career decision that makes sense, regardless of my personal situation here." She was quiet for several seconds. I could hear background noise that suggested she was calling from a restaurant or bar rather than her apartment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something more familiar, the slightly condescending patience she used when she believed I was being unreasonable or emotional about something that required practical consideration. "Look, I understand. You're upset about how things ended between us? Maybe I could have handled that evening better," she said. The closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. But running away to another continent isn't going to solve whatever issues you're dealing with. We've been together for 4 years, David. That kind of history doesn't just disappear because we had a fight. Her framing of our final confrontation as a simple fight rather than the culmination of months of disrespect and incompatibility was typical of her approach to conflict resolution. Jessica had always preferred to minimize the significance of our problems rather than addressing the underlying patterns that created them. And her suggestion that my London decision was primarily emotional rather than professional showed how. Little she understood about my actual priorities and motivations. "This isn't about our relationship," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I recognized they weren't entirely true. While the career opportunity was genuine and valuable, my enthusiasm for it had been amplified by my desire to escape the psychological environment Jessica had created around us. I'm moving to London because it's the right next step for my career. The fact that it also removes me from a situation that wasn't working anymore is just a coincidence. Jessica's laugh was sharp and humorless. The sound she made when she thought someone was being deliberately obtuse or naive. "Come on, David. You're telling me you're willing to leave everything you've built here? All your connections and relationships because some foreign company made you an offer? That doesn't sound like the careful, analytical person I've known. For 4 years, this is obviously a reaction to our temporary problems." Her description of our temporary problems was so fundamentally disconnected from my experience of our relationship that I felt a familiar surge of frustration. The issues between us weren't temporary setbacks that could be resolved through better communication or mutual effort. They were fundamental incompatibilities that had been masked by my willingness to adapt myself to her expectations and preferences. "Our problems weren't temporary," I said, feeling the need to correct her mischaracterization, even though I knew the conversation was unlikely to lead anywhere productive. "We've been growing in different directions for months, maybe longer. You've made it clear that my career aspirations aren't impressive enough for your standards. I've realized that constantly trying to meet your approval isn't sustainable or healthy for me." The silence that followed was longer this time, and when Jessica spoke again, her voice carried a harder edge that suggested her patience with my perspective was wearing thin. "So that's it? You're just going to throw away everything we've built together because you can't handle dating someone more successful than you? I thought you were more mature than that, David." Her ability to reframe my decision as evidence of personal inadequacy rather than a reasonable response to her treatment was both impressive and infuriating. Even now, when I was clearly moving forward with my life in a positive direction, she couldn't resist characterizing my choices as weakness or immaturity, rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the relationship dynamics that had made this conversation necessary. "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied, working to keep my voice level despite the provocation. "I'm accepting an opportunity that aligns with my professional goals and personal values. If that threatens you somehow, then maybe that tells us something important about what our relationship had become." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica alternating between subtle manipulation tactics and increasingly direct attempts to undermine my confidence in my decision. She questioned whether I was prepared for the challenges of international living, suggested that I was abandoning responsibilities to family and friends, and implied that my willingness to leave so suddenly revealed character flaws that would follow me regardless of geographic location. When those approaches failed to shake my resolve, she shifted to reminiscing about positive memories from our early relationship, bringing up specific moments when we'd been happy together, and suggesting that those experiences proved we could recapture what we'd lost if I was willing to be reasonable about working through our current difficulties. Her selective memory was remarkable, focusing entirely on our best times while completely ignoring the months of tension and conflict that had preceded my decision to leave. The final phase of the conversation revealed what I suspected was her real motivation for calling. Jessica had apparently assumed that my silence over the past few weeks indicated uncertainty or regret about ending our relationship. And she'd expected that reaching out would immediately restore the dynamic where she controlled the terms of our interaction. My clear commitment to moving forward without her had forced her to confront the reality that I was no longer willing to prioritize her needs above my own well-being. "Fine," she said, when it became obvious that I wasn't going to change my mind. "Go to London if that's what you think will make you happy. But don't expect me to be here waiting when you realize this was all a mistake and you want to come back to something real." Her parting comment was perfectly calibrated to plant seeds of doubt about my decision while positioning herself as the stable, mature option I was foolishly abandoning. Even in defeat, Jessica couldn't resist trying to maintain psychological control by suggesting that my success or failure in London would ultimately be measured against what I'd given up by leaving her. After I hung up, I sat in my half-packed apartment feeling strangely energized rather than drained by the confrontation. The conversation had clarified something important. Jessica hadn't changed, and neither had the fundamental dynamics that had made our relationship increasingly toxic. Her inability to acknowledge my perspective or respect my autonomy confirmed that leaving was the right decision, regardless of whatever challenges awaited me in London. The following week passed quickly as I finalized my preparations and said goodbye to friends and colleagues in Denver. Marcus threw a small farewell gathering at his apartment, inviting people from our graduate program and his work who'd known me before my relationship with. Jessica had begun to dominate my social life. The contrast was striking. These people remembered and celebrated aspects of my personality that had been suppressed or criticized during the past year. And their enthusiasm for my London opportunity reminded me that supportive relationships were supposed to enhance rather than diminish your sense of self-worth. Professor Martinez arranged a final meeting to provide additional contacts and research materials that might be useful during my early months at Thornfield and Associates. He also shared insights about working in international contexts and adapting to different professional cultures. Practical advice that reflected his genuine investment in my long-term success, rather than his own convenience or emotional needs. "You're making exactly the right choice," he said as our meeting concluded. "This opportunity will challenge you in ways that staying in Denver never could, and the experience will make you a much stronger architect and researcher. Sometimes we need to leave familiar environments to discover what we're really capable of achieving." His confidence was reassuring, particularly coming so soon after Jessica's attempts to undermine my decision. The contrast between his supportive professionalism and her manipulative criticism highlighted just how much my perspective on normal relationships had been distorted over the past year. My departure day arrived with typical December weather: cold, gray, and slightly snowy. The kind of morning that made leaving Denver feel like escaping rather than abandoning something valuable. I'd arranged for a car service to take me to the airport, preferring the clean anonymity of professional transportation to the potential emotional complications of asking friends or family to handle the goodbye logistics. As the driver loaded my luggage into the trunk, I took a final look at my apartment building and the surrounding neighborhood where I'd lived throughout graduate school. The area held many positive memories: late-night study sessions at nearby coffee shops, weekend walks to explore different architectural styles, conversations with classmates about design theories and sustainable building practices. But it also represented a chapter of my life that I was ready to close, a period of growth that had ultimately prepared me for bigger challenges and opportunities. The flight to London was uneventful, giving me hours to read architectural journals and review materials about my new position. Somewhere over the Atlantic, surrounded by strangers pursuing their own journeys to unknown destinations, I felt a profound sense of freedom that had been missing from my life for longer than I cared to calculate. For the first time in months, my future felt entirely my own to determine. London greeted me with January rain and possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine during those final months in Denver. Thornfield and Associates occupied a converted Victorian building in Shoreditch, where historical architecture met cutting-edge design philosophy in ways that perfectly captured my vision of sustainable urban development. My first day at the firm, I met Claire Morrison, a project manager specializing in community housing initiatives who'd been assigned to help integrate me into their ongoing developments. Claire had studied architecture at Cambridge before transitioning into project management, and her approach to sustainable building combined technical expertise with genuine concern for social impact. During our initial meeting, she explained the firm's current projects with an enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with architecture in the first place. Her passion for creating meaningful change through innovative design was infectious. I found myself contributing ideas and asking questions that revealed knowledge and creativity I'd almost forgotten I possessed. Working alongside Claire, over the following weeks, I rediscovered my professional confidence and intellectual curiosity. She valued my research background and actively sought my input on technical challenges, treating my perspectives as valuable contributions rather than inconvenient complications. The contrast with my recent experience in Denver was striking here, with someone who enhanced my capabilities instead of diminishing them, who celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by my achievements. Our collaboration extended beyond office hours as Claire introduced me to London's architectural community through lectures, gallery openings, and informal gatherings where sustainable design practitioners shared insights and challenges. These events reminded me of the intellectual excitement that had originally drawn me to my field. Conversations where ideas mattered more than personal advancement and where collaborative thinking produced innovations that none of us could have achieved individually. 6 months into my London experience, I received an unexpected message from Marcus, updating me on developments in Denver. Jessica had apparently left her marketing position after some unspecified conflict with management, and Ryan had been terminated for inappropriate conduct with multiple female colleagues. The tech startup, where they'd both worked, had undergone significant restructuring, eliminating several positions and fundamentally altering the company culture that had seemed so impressive during Jessica's period of professional ascendancy. Marcus's information painted a picture of consequences and revelations that I might have found satisfying during my more bitter moments. But by then, I was so invested in my new life that their struggles felt irrelevant to my current happiness. The distance, both geographic and emotional, had provided perspective that transformed my anger into indifference, a much healthier state that allowed me to focus entirely on building something positive rather than processing past disappointments. My relationship with Claire had evolved naturally from professional collaboration to personal friendship, and eventually into something deeper that neither of us had anticipated when we first met. Unlike my experience with Jessica, this development felt organic and mutual, based on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than historical momentum or external pressures. Claire appreciated my dedication to meaningful work and supported my career ambitions without feeling competitive or threatened by my success. Our first official date was a walking tour of London's most innovative housing projects, where Claire's expertise in community development complemented my technical knowledge in ways that made our conversation feel like intellectual partnership. We spent hours analyzing design decisions and discussing potential improvements, the kind of engagement that Jessica had dismissed as boring but that Claire found stimulating and valuable. 8 months after leaving Denver, I was promoted to senior designer at Thornfield and Associates, recognition that reflected both my technical contributions and my successful adaptation to international practice. The position came with increased responsibility for client relationships and project leadership, challenges that I approached with confidence that had been rebuilt through consistent, positive reinforcement and meaningful achievements. Claire and I had begun discussing the possibility of starting our own consultancy focused specifically on affordable housing solutions, combining her project management skills with my design expertise to create a practice that could address social justice issues through innovative architecture. The conversation represented everything I valued about healthy partnerships: shared vision, mutual respect, and collaborative planning based on both our strengths rather than one person's dominance over the other. 2 years after my arrival in London, I was walking through Covent Garden with Claire when I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone at an outdoor cafe. Jessica was unmistakable despite the distance, her posture and gestures exactly as I remembered from our years together in Denver. She appeared to be waiting for someone, checking her phone repeatedly with the kind of anxious energy that had characterized many of our later interactions. For a moment, I considered approaching her to say hello, curiosity about her circumstances competing with my preference for leaving the past undisturbed. Claire noticed my hesitation and followed my gaze, immediately understanding the situation. Without requiring explanation, her response was characteristically thoughtful and supportive, suggesting we could continue our walk in a different direction if I preferred to avoid an awkward encounter. "No," I said, surprised by how calm I felt about the possibility of seeing Jessica again. "I think I'd actually like to know how she's doing, if she's happy with whatever changes she's made since we last spoke." We approached her table, and Jessica looked up with an expression that cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been regret. She appeared older than I'd expected, though only 2 years had passed since our last conversation, and there was a tiredness, in her manner that suggested recent difficulties rather than the professional success she'd always prioritized above everything else. "David," she said, standing to greet us with uncertain formality, "I can't believe you're here. You look wonderful, really successful and happy." Her eyes moved to Claire with obvious curiosity and what I interpreted as grudging respect for someone who clearly commanded my attention and affection. Our conversation was brief and surprisingly pleasant, touching on general topics like London's architectural scene and my work at Thornfield and Associates without delving into personal history or relationship analysis. Jessica mentioned that she was visiting London for job interviews with international marketing firms, suggesting that her career had experienced setbacks that required starting over in new environments. When we parted ways 20 minutes later, I felt nothing but genuine goodwill toward her, hoped that she would find whatever professional and personal fulfillment had eluded her in Denver. The encounter confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't fully tested, that my feelings about our relationship had evolved from anger through indifference to something approaching gratitude for lessons learned and growth achieved. Claire and I continued our walk through London, discussing the afternoon's unexpected encounter and marveling at how completely my life had changed since making the decision to leave Denver. That evening, as we sat in our shared flat, planning our weekend visit to a sustainable housing project in Edinburgh, I reflected on the distance I'd traveled both geographically and emotionally from that rainy night when Jessica had kicked me out of her car. The young man who'd stood on that Denver street corner, devastated by rejection and uncertain about his own worth, had been replaced by someone who understood that healthy relationships enhance rather than diminish your sense of self. London had given me more than just career advancement. It had restored my confidence in my own judgment and reminded me that love should feel like support rather than constant evaluation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.